It began with the silence of a ticking clock that never quite ticked. Morty would sit by it often, a small wooden clock with a single hand that refused to move forward. It was always midnight in that little world of his room, no matter how many times he wound it or whispered to it. The clock stayed still, stubborn as if it carried its own secret. And yet, Morty found comfort in its stillness. He would sit cross-legged on the floor, staring at it until his eyes grew heavy, letting the unmoving hand lull him into a kind of dream. He wondered if time itself was broken in his room, if perhaps the world outside still rushed on but inside. These walls, everything slowed down, softened, stretched into quiet. Sometimes, when the world was loud, his parents arguing in faint echoes down the hall, or Rick's voice carrying strange words through the garage, Morty would glance at the clock and think, maybe this is better. Maybe a moment that never moves is safer than one that runs away. He didn't know why he felt this so deeply, only that the clock seemed to understand him more than people did. At night, when the air carried the faint hum of Rick's machines, Morty would lie on his bed and listen. The clock stayed still, but the hum moved, pulsing in patterns like a secret lullaby wrapped in mechanical sighs. Sometimes he thought he could almost hear a tune inside it, something not quite music, but close enough to bring him peace. He never told anyone about this. It was his private song, a sound that promised him that even if the world outside spun too fast, here in this room, time would stay still, gentle and unchanging. He remembered once reaching out his finger to trace the face of the clock, and for the briefest moment he felt warmth where there should have been cold wood. He blinked, startled, but when he touched it again, it was only wood. The warmth was gone. He whispered, "Are you alive?" But of course, the clock gave no answer, only silence. Still, the question hung in the air like a small seed, something that might grow later, though he didn't know it yet. As he grew older, he carried this memory with him, the strange comfort of an object that never moved, the softness of silence. That could cradle him better than words. Sometimes at school, when he felt the hours dragging on and the voices of teachers blurred together, he would imagine the stillness of that clock, and it made him feel calm. Other kids rushed, laughed, shouted, but Morty lingered in a slower rhythm, a half-beat behind everyone else. He didn't mind. To him, it was as though he had a secret agreement with time, that it would not leave him too quickly, that it would wait, and yet he noticed something subtle. When he stared at the clock too long, shadows in the room seemed to stretch differently. The corners bent just slightly, as though the air remembered a different shape. Sometimes he would blink, and the moonlight would feel brighter, though nothing had changed. It unsettled him, but only a little. Mostly it made him feel curious, like he was peeking into something too big for him to understand, and yet somehow it belonged to him. Rick once caught him staring at the clock. Morty startled, embarrassed, but Rick only gave a small grunt, then turned away without a word. Still Morty noticed the pause, just long enough to mean something. He wondered if Rick knew more about the clock than he let on, but he never asked. Some things were better left unspoken. Nights passed like this, quiet and unhurried. The clock's stillness became part of Morty's heartbeat, steady and soft. And though he couldn't explain why, he began to sense that this unmoving time was not emptiness, but preparation. That one day something would bloom from it, the way seeds bloom when left long enough in darkness. He didn't need to rush it. For now, he would listen, he would wait, he would breathe with the silence. The boy who sat before a frozen clock did not yet know he was learning patience. He did not yet know that his waiting, his stillness, would become the quiet strength he carried into every moment of his strange life. All he knew was that the clock never moved, and yet somehow, deep inside, he felt that he was slowly moving forward with it, step by gentle step, towards something unseen. And so the days gathered quietly, each one folding into the next like pages. In a book that Morty never hurried to finish, the clock remained still, and Morty learned to carry its patience inside him. Yet sometimes, when the house fell into its softest silence and the air grew heavy, he would hear it, the faintest thread of melody weaving through the hum of machines, like a lullaby that belonged to no one and everyone at once. He could never decide if the tune came from Rick's garage, or from the clock itself, or from some deeper place that had always lived inside him. But it soothed him, even as it left questions behind. The lullaby became his secret companion. It wasn't a song with words, not something he could hum back, but more like a breath, a rhythm that entered his chest and made him feel less alone. Some nights, when the world seemed too large for him, Morty would whisper to the melody as if it could hear, "I know you're there, please don't go away." And though the hum never answered, he always felt as though it stayed with him just long enough to help him drift towards sleep. One evening, as the lullaby swelled faintly in the background, Morty imagined himself as very small, so small that the entire universe could cup him gently in its hands. He pictured the stars leaning close, listening to his thoughts. It wasn't frightening. If anything, it felt like belonging, like maybe his life was tied to something bigger than the hallway arguments, the slammed doors, the restless sighs of his parents. The stars didn't judge him, they simply listened. And in their silence, he felt understood. But the mystery of the tune began to deepen. On certain nights it grew stronger, almost sharp, threading through his dreams until he woke with the sound still clinging to him. Once, when the melody was especially clear, Morty tiptoed down the hall and peeked into Rick's garage. The lights flickered strangely, shadows darting in shapes he couldn't name. Rick sat slumped at his desk, not asleep, but not fully awake, muttering to himself in half-formed words. Morty froze, listening. Beneath Rick's low murmur was that same lullaby, clearer now, almost as though the machines themselves were breathing it. He wanted to ask about it, but something in Rick's expression, hollow, tired, worn thin like paper, stopped him. Morty backed away quietly, carrying the song with him like a secret too fragile to share. From that night on, the tune felt both comforting and sorrowful, as though it belonged not only to him, but also to the man who carried too much on his shoulders. The days afterward were filled with an odd awareness. Morty began noticing little things. How the hum of fluorescent lights in school almost matched the rhythm, how wind slipping through cracked windows seemed to echo the same cadence. Even the tick of the clocks in the hallway, unlike his own at home, seemed to stutter when he passed, as if caught in the memory of that hidden melody. Time bent itself into quiet knots just for him, and though he couldn't explain it, he started to believe it was no accident. There was one night, late and heavy with summer heat, when Morty awoke to silence so thick it made his ears ring. The melody was gone. The hum of the machines was absent. Even the world outside, no crickets, no wind, seemed to hold its breath. Morty sat up in bed, uneasy. He turned his gaze to the unmoving clock. In the hush, the stillness felt alive again, as though the clock itself had stolen the song away. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with longing, an ache that felt older than him. He reached out once more to touch the wooden frame, and just like before he felt it. Warmth beneath his fingertips, the quiet pulse of something that should not have been there. This time he didn't pull away. He let his hand rest against the warmth, eyes closing, breathing slowly as though he could sink his heart to whatever lived inside the clock. And though the melody never returned in that moment, a different feeling bloomed, an assurance, tender and patient, whispering that time itself was listening to him, that it had not abandoned him, that it was waiting just as he was waiting. Morty lay back down, his palm tingling, his thoughts drifting like clouds. The clock remained silent, unmoving, but the warmth stayed with him, tucked into his chest as if carried in the folds of a dream. He knew, without needing proof, that he had stepped just a little closer to something larger than himself. He didn't yet know where it would lead, but the seed had been planted. And like the quiet music he once heard, it would return in its own time. Morning came softly after that night, though Morty barely noticed the difference. The warmth he had felt from the clock lingered in his chest like an ember, faint but steady, and it followed him into the light of day. At breakfast, the chatter of his family blurred into background noise. His parents exchanged clipped words, his sister rolled her eyes, and Rick sat with a flask instead of coffee. Morty barely heard them. All he could think of was how his hand had pulsed with life when it touched the clock. He carried it with him like a secret no one else could see. That day at school the world moved as it always did. Teachers spoke, pages turned, footsteps echoed in the halls, but Morty noticed how it all seemed to stutter in small ways. A pencil, rolling across a desk, slowed just a fraction before reaching the edge. A hallway bell rang, but the echo seemed to linger longer than usual. Even a bird outside the window appeared to hover mid-flight for one impossible breath. No one else noticed, only Morty. And though it unsettled him, he couldn't help but feel it was connected to the clock, to that warmth that refused to leave his chest. He began testing it, quietly, when no one was watching. In class, he tapped his finger against the desk in rhythm with the ticking wall clock. He found that if he focused hard enough, the tick seemed to stretch, like a piece of string pulled taut. He would blink, and suddenly he realized the world around him moved just slightly slower than before. Not enough to frighten him, not enough to draw attention, but enough to make him wonder if he was bending with time or if time was bending with him. One afternoon, walking home, Morty stopped at the park bench near the corner. A breeze brushed past, carrying the scent of grass and dust, and the sound of laughter drifted from children playing nearby. He sat down and placed his palms on his knees, breathing slowly. He closed his eyes, imagining the warmth of the clock beneath his hands. And there it was again, that faint hum, like the memory of the lullaby. The world around him seemed to pause. The voices softened, the wind quieted, and for a moment he felt as though he was the still point in the middle of everything moving. Then it slipped away, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat. That night, Morty couldn't sleep. He turned, the thought over and over in his mind. If the clock had passed something into him, was it a gift or a curse? He didn't know, but when he pressed his palm against the clock again, the warmth returned, stronger this time, almost pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. His eyes grew heavy, and in that half-awake state, he thought he saw the hand of the clock twitch, not forward, but sideways, as though time had shifted its rules for him alone. He blinked, and it was still again, but the vision clung to him like a secret smile. Rick passed his room later, muttering under his breath, and Morty pulled his hand away quickly, but Rick's footsteps slowed. He lingered by the door, silent, before walking on. Morty wondered if Rick already knew, if maybe the old man had planted the clock in his room for this very reason. The thought unsettled him, but also comforted him because it meant he wasn't alone in whatever was happening. The following days unfolded like this: small discoveries, subtle pauses, breaths that felt longer than they should. Morty began to understand that the warmth wasn't just inside the clock anymore, it was inside him. And though he couldn't explain it, he felt that this quiet strangeness would guide him somewhere important, even if he didn't yet know where. He fell asleep that night with the window open, listening to the stars beyond. For the first time, he felt as though the sky itself was humming along with the melody, slow and patient, waiting for him to learn the rhythm. And as he drifted off, Morty realized that he wasn't afraid of the stillness anymore. He was becoming part of it, and somewhere deep inside, he sensed that the story of his life had just begun. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though Morty could never call it ordinary anymore. The warmth inside him seemed to awaken at unexpected moments, like a hidden current humming beneath his skin. Sometimes it came when he was doing nothing at all, sitting on the back porch, watching the fading sky. Other times, it stirred when the world felt too loud, like when his parents argued in half-shouted whispers after dinner. In those moments, Morty would retreat into himself, breathe slowly, and feel the clock's quiet pulse echoing in his chest. It steadied him in ways he couldn't explain, as if time itself was choosing to comfort him. One evening, while walking home alone, Morty noticed the street lamps flickering in their usual tired rhythm. But when he stepped beneath one, the flicker slowed. The glow stretched into long blinks, almost as though the lamp were pausing with him. Morty stopped in place, holding his breath. For a moment, everything seemed caught in suspension. The leaves, trembling on their branches, the distant bark of a dog, even the faint hum of passing cars. It was all still, held together by some invisible thread he had unknowingly touched. Then the world exhaled, and time moved again. Morty shivered, both unsettled and awed. He hadn't meant to do it. It was simply happening now, more and more. At school, the changes were harder to ignore. He would sit in class, staring at the board, and notice how the chalk dust hung in the air a fraction too long before drifting down. Once during gym, a basketball froze mid-bounce for the briefest instant before continuing on, as though nothing had changed. His classmates never noticed, their voices rising and falling as if the world had moved normally. Morty realized, with a strange mix of fear and wonder, that the stillness was his alone. But it wasn't only the world around him that shifted. Inside, Morty felt something gentler growing. When time slowed, he noticed people differently. He saw the crease in his teacher's forehead soften when she paused to collect her thoughts. He saw a classmate's nervous fingers tapping against a desk, hidden beneath their loud laughter. He saw his sister, Summer, scrolling through her phone with a look of weariness she rarely showed. These details passed unnoticed in the rush of normal time, but when the world bent for Morty, he could see the quiet truths people carried. And though he didn't always understand them, he felt them deeply, as though the stillness itself was teaching him to listen. One night, unable to sleep, Morty returned to the clock. He sat cross-legged before it, staring into its unmoving face. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The clock gave no answer, but once again warmth spread beneath his fingertips when he touched it. This time, though, he didn't feel only comfort. He felt weight, as though the stillness was no longer simply a gift, but a responsibility waiting to be understood. The thought frightened him, yet it also filled him with quiet determination. Rick passed by again that night, lingering in the hallway just long enough for Morty to notice. He didn't come in, didn't speak, but the pause was telling. Morty had the sense that Rick knew far more than he let on, that the silence between them was deliberate. And though Rick's absence of words could feel like distance, Morty felt something else beneath it, a reluctant kind of protection, an unspoken acknowledgement that Morty's stillness was important. Lying in bed afterward, Morty thought of the lullaby again. Though faint, it was always there in the background, carried by the hum of wires or the sigh of wind. He realized it wasn't only sound, it was feeling. It was the rhythm of patience, of waiting without rushing, of letting things bloom in their own time. As he drifted into sleep, he carried that rhythm with him, letting it weave through his dreams. The next morning, when he woke, he looked at the clock once more. It had not moved, and yet something inside him had. He no longer saw it as broken or stubborn, he saw it as a mirror. And in its silence, Morty understood that he was only at the beginning of a story much larger than himself. A story written in pauses, in breaths, in the quiet moments that most people overlooked. He was learning to see them. And soon he would learn what they truly meant. Morning light spilled across Morty's room, soft and pale, stretching shadows over the floorboards. He woke slowly, his eyes drifting first to the familiar shape of the clock. Its single hand had not moved, but something in the way it sat on the shelf felt different now, as if it were no longer just an object in the room, but a quiet companion, watching him. He lay there for a long time, listening to the stillness, and felt the same steady warmth rising in his chest. It was no longer surprising to him, it was becoming a part of who he was. At school he carried that feeling with him, though he tried to hide it. When his friends joked or when teachers scolded, he moved along with them, nodding when expected, laughing softly when everyone else did. But behind his eyes, he was somewhere else, measuring the spaces between words, noticing the way sound and silence braided together. Even the smallest moments began to glow with detail. He noticed how the dust in the air seemed to drift slower when someone was sad, how laughter seemed to bend time itself into bursts that passed too quickly. These weren't powers in the way Rick's inventions were powers. They were softer, stranger, and yet somehow heavier because they touched the hidden truths of people. One afternoon, while sitting on the school steps, Morty saw a girl crying quietly into her hands. No one else paid attention. Students streamed past, chattering and rushing, but Morty felt the warmth rise in his chest again. The world bent gently, slowing as if urging him not to miss this moment. He sat beside her, unsure of what to say, and for a long while he didn't speak at all. When she finally lifted her face, she didn't meet his eyes, but she didn't move away either. Morty offered half of his sandwich, an ordinary gesture, yet in the stillness it felt like something larger, like the universe itself leaning close. She accepted it, and in that small act, Morty felt the warmth soften into quiet gratitude. He didn't understand why, but it mattered. It mattered deeply. That night, when he returned to his room, the clock seemed to hum faintly, though no sound came from it. He touched the wooden frame once again, and for the first time he didn't feel only warmth. He felt something like memory, as if the clock was aware of what he had done as if it had seen him share kindness and held on to it. The realization sent a shiver through him. Perhaps this wasn't just about stillness or slowing time. Perhaps the clock was teaching him how to live, how to notice, how to care, how to let small acts carry the weight of something much greater. Rick passed his room again, as he often did, but this time Morty thought he heard the faintest sigh from him, a sound that carried neither annoyance nor dismissal. It was weary, yes, but also strangely proud, like a note in a song Morty couldn't quite decipher. He wondered if Rick, in his silence, had once carried a similar warmth and had long since buried it. The thought made Morty's chest ache, not with pity, but with an understanding he didn't have words for yet. As days stretched on, Morty's connection to the stillness deepened. He began to see patterns in the way time bent. Moments of sorrow stretched longer, moments of joy passed in a blink. And yet he sensed that by noticing, by truly being present, he could shift the rhythm just slightly, enough to let a laugh last a little longer, enough to let a goodbye soften into something less sharp. It wasn't control, not exactly. It was more like companionship, as if time itself was walking beside him, showing him how fragile and precious each instant truly was. He fell asleep that night with a new thought resting on his heart. Maybe the clock wasn't broken after all. Maybe it was perfect in its stillness, because it had taught him that life wasn't about rushing forward, but about being awake in the spaces most people hurried past. And as sleep took him, Morty dreamed of stars blinking in rhythm with his breath, each one a reminder that the universe had been waiting for him to notice all along. Rick had always been a storm moving through Morty's life, loud, erratic, filled with sparks and shadows that Morty never quite understood. Yet lately, Morty noticed something quieter behind that storm, something he might not have recognized if not for the stillness the clock had given him. It was in the way Rick's shoulders slumped when no one was looking, in the pauses between his words when he pretended not to care. Morty began to see those spaces not as emptiness but as openings, small cracks where truth slipped through. And though Rick would never admit it, Morty felt the faint thread of connection pulling tighter between them. One night, Morty found himself in the garage while Rick tinkered. The air buzzed with the scent of metal and ozone, the machines pulsing with quiet life. Morty stood at the edge, watching, feeling the familiar hum rising in his chest. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just waited. Rick muttered curses at wires and glass tubes, but when Morty stayed silent long enough, Rick glanced up. Their eyes met briefly, and though Rick only scoffed and returned to his work, Morty caught something in that look, something like acknowledgement. It wasn't warmth, not exactly, but it was a kind of unspoken trust, as if Rick had noticed Morty's patience and didn't mind it lingering nearby. Morty sat on a stool, hands resting on his knees, and let the hum of the machines wrap around him. Time bent gently again, softening the edges of the room. He noticed the sparks from Rick's tools hanging longer in the air, as though reluctant to fade. He wondered if Rick felt it too, if maybe the storm inside him slowed for just a moment when Morty was there. The thought gave him a quiet sense of purpose, one he didn't need to name out loud. The following days, Morty began spending more time in the garage. Not asking questions, not pushing, just being there. Sometimes Rick ignored him completely. Other times he barked at him to hand over tools, but Morty noticed the difference. Rick's voice, though sharp, held less impatience when Morty didn't. Rush when he simply listened and moved at the rhythm time allowed. In those moments, Morty realized that patience could be its own kind of language, one that spoke without words. One evening, As Morty passed him a wrench, Rick paused longer than usual. He didn't say thank you, didn't offer anything at all, but Morty saw the way his hand lingered on the tool before pulling it away. A pause, so small, most would miss it, but Morty felt it deeply. It was as if Rick, too, was learning to let a moment last longer than it needed to. That night, Morty lay awake, staring at the still clock. He thought about how much had shifted between them without a single conversation about it. Rick would never tell him he cared, never wrap his words in softness, but Morty didn't need him to. The stillness had taught him to listen beneath the noise, to feel what people could not say. And Rick, in his silence, spoke volumes. But with this new closeness came unease. Morty began to sense that the clock's gift was not his alone to carry forever. There was weight to it, a quiet demand that he couldn't yet name. He thought about the way the girl at school had accepted his sandwich, how Rick had paused with the wrench, how even the world itself seemed to bend when he noticed it deeply enough. The pattern was forming, though he didn't understand its shape. It was guiding him, step by step, towards something waiting beyond the edges of his small world. He pressed his palm to the clock once more, and warmth answered him. Not comfort this time, but a steady reminder. He wasn't just waiting anymore, he was being prepared. For what, he didn't know, but as he drifted into sleep, he felt the hum of the machines, the softness of Rick's unspoken pauses, and the faint thread of connection binding it all together. The story was carrying him forward, and he would not turn away. Morty woke the next morning with the lingering weight of the clock's hum still pressed into his chest, as if it had followed him out of sleep and into waking. He moved through the house slowly, each creak of the floorboards sharper than usual, each faint rustle of wind against the window reminding him that the world was listening too. Rick hadn't come down for breakfast yet, and the silence of the kitchen only made Morty more aware of the way time bent around him, urging him to pay attention. It wasn't just about the moments themselves anymore, it was about what those moments were pointing him toward. At school, he felt the change more than ever. Hallways filled with noise and rushing footsteps seemed stretched thin, like they might tear if anyone moved too fast. Morty walked through them quietly, his gaze drawn to details he'd never cared about before. The nervous tapping of a kid's pencil against a binder, the way a teacher's voice wavered when she called out attendance, even the way his own breath seemed to settle heavier in his chest. All of it mattered, though he didn't yet know why. And then, at lunch, the girl from the other day caught his eye. She didn't smile, didn't wave, but the glance she gave him held something steady, as though she, too, had felt a pause in the rush of everything. Morty sat across from her without thinking, his tray clattering softly onto the table. The silence between them stretched, yet it didn't feel awkward. It was the same kind of stillness the clock gave him, patient and unhurried. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, almost as if she knew the world might listen too closely if she spoke too loud. You notice things, don't you? Morty froze. The words echoed deeper than they should have, almost like she wasn't just talking about him watching people or handing her a sandwich. He nodded slowly, unsure if admitting it would pull something out into the open that he wasn't ready for. She didn't press further, only gave a small nod back, her eyes scanning him in a way that felt like recognition. And then, just as suddenly, she turned her attention to her food, leaving Morty with more questions than answers. That evening, back in the garage, Rick was buried in his work again. Sparks lit the air, smoke curled in faint wisps, and Morty sat quietly at his usual spot. But now his thoughts kept circling back to the girl's words. She had seen something in him, something he hadn't spoken about to anyone. He wondered if Rick knew too. He wondered if Rick's long pauses, his strange silences, were not just quirks, but choices, maybe even a kind of awareness like Morty's, though buried deeper under layers of cynicism and noise. As if on cue, Rick slammed a piece of machinery onto the table and groaned.
"You're staring again, Morty. Either say something or stop burning a hole in the back of my head." Morty flinched, but didn't look away. "Do you ever notice stuff, like the way moments feel longer than they should? Like they're
waiting for you to pay attention?" His voice shook, but he forced it out anyway. Rick went still, his hand hovering over a tool. For a second, the silence stretched the way it did when Morty touched the clock, thick and deliberate. Then Rick snorted, grabbing the wrench again. "Kid, you're thinking too much. The universe doesn't wait for anybody."
It chews you up and spits you out whether you're looking or not. But Morty caught it, the hesitation before Rick spoke, the flicker in his eyes that betrayed something unspoken. He wanted to ask more, but he knew pressing Rick would only
make him retreat. So instead, Morty stayed quiet, letting the hum of the machines fill the air. Later that night, alone in his room, Morty held the clock once more. Its surface was cool, but the warmth pulsed faintly beneath, like a heartbeat. He thought about the girl's question, about Rick's denial, about the way moments seemed to connect when he truly noticed them. A pattern was forming, clearer now than before. Someone else could see it. Rick might feel it too, even if he refused to say it. Morty wasn't alone in this. He was part of something bigger, something stretching out beyond the edges of his life. The hum deepened, and the clock's hands trembled as though responding to his thoughts. Morty closed his eyes, breathing with it, and in that breath he felt the world leaning closer, whispering in its silence. Pay attention. It's only beginning. The next morning unfolded with the same quiet hum that had followed Morty in his dreams, the kind of hum that didn't leave when his eyes opened, but instead blended with the ordinary sounds of life. He brushed his teeth, walked down the hallway, and yet every step seemed faintly slowed, as though the air itself remembered the clock's whisper. At breakfast, Rick sat at the table with a newspaper he didn't really read, his eyes darting between lines as though chasing thoughts Morty couldn't see. Morty poured himself cereal, watching the milk swirl over the flakes, wondering if the swirl meant more than it should. School was different that day. Not louder, not quieter, just sharper. Morty caught the way a teacher's sleeve brushed chalk dust off the board, the faint rhythm of a classmate's sigh, the sunlight angling through the window in golden beams that seemed too deliberate to be random. And then there was the girl again, seated at her usual table, eating slowly as though her mind was elsewhere. Morty sat near her, not too close, but close enough that when she glanced up, she didn't look surprised. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her voice just above a whisper. "You feel it too, don't you?" Morty's heart tightened, the air catching in his lungs. He wanted to ask what exactly she meant, but he already knew. She was speaking about the same stretched seconds, the same strange awareness. He nodded carefully, afraid that words might make it vanish. She smiled faintly, not with joy, but with recognition, as if they were both carrying a secret too fragile to share with anyone else. "It's not just you," she said softly. "And it's not just me either. The world slows down for some of
us, like it wants us to notice the pieces everyone else misses." Before Morty could respond, the bell rang, and the spell of their quiet exchange broke. She stood quickly, brushing past him with a look that told him this was only the beginning of a longer conversation.
He walked to class with his chest buzzing, the hum of the clock echoing even though he hadn't touched it. That night, in the garage, Rick worked late into the hours, muttering to himself over scattered wires and blinking lights. Morty sat nearby, the clock in his hands, though he didn't open it this time. Instead, he studied Rick's movements, the way he paused between each adjustment, how his hands lingered over the machine before tightening bolts or flipping switches. Morty saw it now, the same awareness he had. Rick hid it beneath sarcasm
And noise, but in those pauses, in those deliberate hesitations, it was there. Rick, Morty said quietly, almost testing the weight of his own voice.
What if time doesn't just move forward? What if it bends to the people who can really see it? Rick froze, tools in hand. His eyes flicked toward Morty for a split second before darting away again. Morty, you sound like a fortune cookie that got dropped in a science lab. Time doesn't bend, people do, that's the trick. Don't mistake your brain for the universe, it'll mess you up. But Morty heard what Rick didn't say. The pause before the joke. The silence stretching out after. The hum of the machine seemed to match the rhythm of the clock in Morty's lap, and for a moment he swore the garage itself was leaning in closer, listening. Later, when Rick had stumbled off to bed, Morty stayed behind. He opened the clock carefully, and the hum rose again, steady and patient. This time, instead of fear, he felt an odd kind of trust. The girl knew. Rick knew, even if he denied it. And Morty himself. He was beginning to accept that whatever was unfolding wasn't just chance. It was a thread pulling him forward, weaving him into something larger, something he couldn't yet name. He set the clock down on the workbench and whispered into the dim garage, as if speaking to the hum itself. I'll keep noticing.
I'll keep listening. Just show me what I'm supposed to see. The hum didn't answer, but Morty felt it, deep in his chest, quiet and certain. He wasn't alone anymore. The story of time had only just begun, and somehow it was waiting
for him to step fully into it. Morty carried the weight of the hum with him the next day, like a song only he could hear. It was there when he woke, steady beneath the rustle of his bedsheets, and it followed him through the hallways of school, humming faintly under every conversation, every glance. He began testing it, quietly, without anyone knowing. He would stop walking in the middle of the hall and notice how people seemed to move past him in slow swirls, as though the world tilted just enough to give him a second longer. He would drop a pencil, watching how the fall stretched into a soft drift before it touched the floor. It was subtle, never dramatic, but it was real, and each small test made him certain the hum wasn't just in his imagination. At lunch, he found himself searching for the girl again. She was already seated, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze fixed on the space just beyond the window. When Morty sat down, she didn't look surprised. She simply asked, "Did you try?"
it. He blinked at her, unsure how to answer, but she nodded as if she already knew.
"You don't need to explain," she said softly. "The world bends, and once you notice, you can't unsee it." Morty wanted to ask how long she had known, how she had discovered it, whether she had felt the same hum he did when he held the clock. But something about her calm silence told him this wasn't the time. She gave him a look, steady, almost kind, and then turned her focus back to the window. Morty followed her gaze and saw nothing unusual, just clouds drifting,
light shifting, but maybe that was the point.
That evening, in the garage, Morty decided to test the hum in front of Rick. He picked up a small bolt from the workbench, holding it above the floor. He let it slip through his fingers, and again it fell slower than it should have, spiraling, with deliberate grace before clinking against the ground. Rick didn't look up, but Morty saw the twitch in his jaw, the way his hand froze for a second too long over the wires. "Rick," Morty whispered, his voice low. "You saw that, right?" Rick sighed, not lifting his gaze. "I saw you waste. A perfectly good bolt, Morty. Gravity's not a magic trick. Quit making patterns where there aren't any." But Morty knew better now. He heard the edge in Rick's voice, the same hesitation he had noticed before. Rick was pretending not to see, and that realization unsettled Morty more than denial itself. Why would Rick hide it? Why not admit it out loud? That night, Morty stayed awake long after the house had gone quiet. The clock sat on his desk, its hum filling the silence like a lullaby. He thought of the girl, her calm certainty, her gaze toward the window. He thought of Rick, refusing to admit what was right in front of him. And he thought of himself, caught in the middle, slowly being pulled deeper into something that felt both wondrous and inevitable. Morty leaned closer to the clock, whispering as though speaking to a friend. "I'll keep noticing. I'll keep
Listening. Just don't leave me alone in this." His words melted into the hum, and for a moment he felt the strange sense that the world was listening back. The next morning, as he walked to school, he tried one more test. He paused at the curb, watching cars pass. For a brief second, the noise of engines softened, the air seemed to hold still, and he could see the gleam of sunlight flashing off the windshield of each car, one after another, as if the moment had stretched just for him. Morty smiled faintly, knowing it was real now, knowing that the hum was guiding him. The story wasn't just happening around him anymore. He was part of it, stitched into something larger, something waiting patiently for him to step further. Morty couldn't shake the way the morning light had lingered on the cars, how each beam of sunlight had felt like a message meant only for him. By the time he reached school, the hum of the clock had woven itself into his heartbeat, steady and patient. He sat in class, trying to focus on the teacher's words, but every sound carried more weight than it should. The scrape of a chair, the flutter of paper, even the faint tapping of a pen on a desk. Each detail seemed connected, part of a larger rhythm he couldn't yet see, but felt with absolute certainty. When lunch came, he found her again. The girl was already waiting, sitting in the same place, her expression calm but unreadable. Morty sat down, his hands restless, his thoughts tumbling faster than his words could follow. She studied him for a long moment, then said, "It's louder now, isn't it?" Morty blinked, startled, though he didn't ask how she knew. Instead, he whispered, "It's like it's everywhere. Like it's pulling me toward something." She nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had always expected. "It doesn't pull you without reason. It wants you to notice connections, not just between moments, but between people. Once you see those threads, you'll realize you're never really alone in it." Her words settled in Morty's chest, heavy and comforting all at once. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but before he could, the bell rang again, scattering the cafeteria noise into hurried footsteps and chatter. She stood and slipped away into the crowd, leaving Morty with the strange sense that she had told him exactly enough and nothing more. That evening in the garage, Morty studied Rick more closely than ever. Rick muttered and clanged, his usual rhythm of chaos, but in the spaces between his movements, Morty saw it. the threads the girl had spoken of. Rick's hand lingered just a second longer over a wire. His eyes flicked toward Morty without words. His sighs carried a weight Morty
could finally feel. It was as though the hum had softened the walls between them, letting Morty glimpse what Rick carried inside, even if Rick would never admit it aloud. For the first time, Morty didn't feel frustrated with Rick's silence. Instead, he felt a kind of reverence, like maybe Rick was part of this pattern too, unwilling to show it, but unable to escape it. The realization filled Morty with a quiet awe that stayed with him long after Rick had left the garage for the night. Later, in his room, Morty held the clock and closed his eyes. The hum rose, gentle and steady, and for the first time he noticed something else. A faint echo beneath it, softer than a whisper, like a voice hidden in the spaces between. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound itself brought comfort, like the feeling of someone sitting beside you in silence. The next day, Morty began watching the people around him more carefully. He saw the tired eyes of his teacher soften when she paused at a student's desk, the way a friend's laugh carried warmth even when it cracked at the edges, the way the girl's glance anchored him in a crowded hallway. These weren't just details anymore, they were threads, each humming faintly, connecting him to others in ways that felt both invisible and undeniable. Morty realized then that the hum wasn't just inside the clock or inside him. It was between them all, binding their quiet moments together. The thought filled him with a strange mix of wonder and responsibility. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant to be his alone. That night, as he drifted towards sleep, Morty whispered to the dark, "I'll keep listening. I'll keep following. Just don't let me lose the threads." The hum answered, steady and patient, as though promising he never would. Morty woke the next morning with a strange sense of anticipation, as though the hum had followed him into his dreams and left its echo inside his chest. The day looked ordinary, sunlight slanting through the blinds, footsteps creaking down the hall, but Morty knew it wasn't. The threads were still there, waiting for him to notice them, and he felt a pull to test them, to see if he could gently touch the weave of things and watch it shift. At school he moved slower than usual, watching the rhythm of people's lives with deliberate care. He noticed the way a kid dropped his books in the hall, the sound clattering sharper than the chatter around them. Normally Morty would have kept walking, but something tugged at him. He bent down, scooped up the books and handed them back. The kid's startled smile lingered longer than expected, and for a fleeting second, Morty felt the hum stretch between them, steady and warm. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The thread had pulsed in recognition, like a string touched by sound. Later in class, Morty tried again. He leaned over and whispered an answer to a girl who'd been too nervous to raise her hand. She didn't say thank you, not out loud, but her shoulders softened, and Morty felt it again, that subtle ripple, small but certain. Every choice carried, more than he'd ever realized, and now that he could feel the hum between people, the world seemed alive in ways that once felt invisible. At lunch, the girl was waiting. She didn't look surprised when he sat across from her, though her eyes studied him with quiet intensity. "You've started testing it," she said, simply. Morty nodded, unsure if he should be proud or scared. "It's not about control," she continued, her voice low and calm. "It's about attention. The moment you treat it like power, it slips away. But if you treat it like connection, it grows stronger." Her words sank into him with the weight of truth. Morty thought about Rick, about how Rick pushed against the world with force, bending it to his will. Morty wondered if that was why Rick pretended not to see the threads, because he didn't know how to soften his grip enough to feel them. The idea stung, but it also gave Morty a kind of resolve. Maybe his role wasn't to challenge the world, but to listen to it. That evening, back in the garage, Morty sat quietly while Rick tinkered with another machine. Sparks flickered. The scent of metal filled the air, but Morty's attention drifted to Rick himself. The lines etched deeper in his face, the way his hand trembled ever so slightly when he thought no one was watching. Morty didn't speak, didn't point it out. Instead, he just sat there, letting his silence be a form of presence. To his surprise, Rick's shoulders eased, only slightly, as if he'd felt the unspoken thread too. When Morty went to bed, he placed the clock on the nightstand and listened to its hum. This time, it didn't feel like a secret meant only for him. It felt like a bridge linking him to the people he cared about, even to those who pretended they didn't care back. The girl had been right. The hum wasn't power, it was connection. As he drifted towards sleep, Morty whispered to himself, "I'll keep noticing. I'll keep holding on to the threads." The hum steadied in reply, weaving itself into the rhythm of his breath. And in that quiet, Morty felt less like he was carrying the weight of a secret, and more like he was being carried by it, gently, towards something greater that was still unfolding. Morty woke with the soft hum still moving through him, a quiet reminder that the threads were never far, never separate. He walked to school with a strange calmness, noticing the way the world unfolded around him like a series of gentle ripples. A leaf fell from a branch, twirling through the air before landing on the ground, and Morty felt as though the moment had stretched just for him, allowing him to see not just the leaf, but the space it traveled through, the stillness it left behind. Everything carried a rhythm now, and he knew he was being asked to pay attention. At school, he began to test the edges of what he felt. He didn't do anything dramatic, just small choices, quiet acts. When a classmate looked lost, Morty offered a word of help. When someone sat alone, he slid his tray a little closer, not speaking much but letting his presence bridge the gap. Each time, the hum stirred, not loud, but certain, as if the world was nodding in quiet approval. It wasn't only about him and the people directly beside him. The threads moved outward, carrying weight he couldn't measure but could feel. One moment struck him more than the others. A teacher dropped her chalk, and Morty bent to pick it up. Their hands brushed just briefly, and her eyes softened in a way that told him the simple act had mattered more than it should have. Later that day, he noticed her tone gentler with the class, her patience stretched a little longer. The thread had extended past Morty, shaping something beyond him, and the realization settled into him with both wonder and responsibility. At lunch, the girl was waiting again, her gaze steady as he sat down. "You're starting to see it," she said, her words almost a whisper. Morty nodded, though his thoughts were racing. "It's not just about you," she continued. "Every choice pulls at something further away. A word, a gesture, even silence, it all ripples outward. That's how the threads work. They don't stop where you do." Morty swallowed hard, thinking about Rick, about how often Rick's words cut sharp and careless. He wondered how many threads Rick had bent without even realizing. The thought made Morty ache, but it also gave him clarity. If the threads really reached outward, if they touched more than just the immediate moment, then every small act mattered in ways he couldn't ignore. That evening, in the garage, Morty stayed quiet again, watching Rick work. But this time he paid attention not just to Rick's movements, but to the space between them, the pauses, the sighs, the hesitation in his hands. Morty didn't speak, didn't push, but his quiet presence felt heavier, fuller, as though the thread between them was humming more clearly now. Rick didn't say anything either, but at one point his muttering softened, and Morty thought he saw the faintest flicker of ease in his expression. Later, in his room, Morty held the clock again. The hum rose as always, but now he heard it differently. It wasn't a single note. It was layered, carrying countless echoes, as though each thread had its own quiet song. He thought of the teacher's softened voice, the classmate's grateful smile, the way the girl's words steadied him, the way Rick's silence seemed a little less heavy. All of it was there, woven together, rippling outward in ways Morty couldn't trace but could feel. He closed his eyes, letting the sound settle into him, and whispered, "I'll be careful. I'll keep noticing. I'll keep listening." The beatsy hum steadied in response. Not loud, not urgent, just patient, as if reminding him that he wasn't shaping the world alone. He was part of it, one thread among many, and together they were weaving something far greater than he could yet understand. As he drifted towards sleep, Morty felt lighter, yet deeply connected, as though the world itself had laid a hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward with quiet trust. Morning light filtered through Morty's blinds, painting his room in soft streaks of gold. He stirred slowly, the memory of the hum still lingering in his chest, like a pulse that had never faded through the night. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was waking up to a world that simply existed. He felt like he was stepping into something alive, a web that stretched around him, waiting for him to notice its shape. He moved with quiet care, brushing his teeth, tying his shoelaces, each action infused with a strange weight, as if even the smallest routines were threads being tugged into place. But as the day unfolded, Morty realized the hum wasn't only there during moments of peace. It flickered at unexpected times, sharpening when tension surfaced. At school, two boys argued in the hallway, their voices cutting through the air, sharp and brittle. Morty froze, the hum rising suddenly within him, urgent and unsteady. It was as though the threads were warning him. This moment mattered too. He didn't step in, didn't know how, but he stood still long enough to see how quickly the fight escalated when no one bridged the silence between them. A shove, a scowl, a teacher rushing over. Morty watched the threads twist into something tangled, and it unsettled him deeply. Later, at lunch, he sat with the girl again. She didn't greet him with her usual calm smile. Instead, her gaze was steady, searching. "You felt it, didn't you?" she asked. Morty nodded slowly, his stomach tightening. "It's not only kindness that stirs the threads," she continued. "Conflict does too. Every choice made in anger or fear sends ripples just as wide as the ones made in care. Sometimes wider." Her voice lowered, almost regretful. "That's why the threads are dangerous. They don't stop moving just because you're not ready." The weight of her words pressed against him all afternoon. Morty couldn't shake the scene in the hallway, the way the fight had left behind a residue that clung to him even now. He wondered how many times he'd looked away before, how many small moments of tension had gone unchecked, each one carrying ripples he'd never bothered to see. That evening, he entered the garage more carefully than usual. Rick was hunched over a workbench, sparks flashing as metal ground against metal. Morty stood quietly, watching, and the hum flickered again, this time restless, unsettled. Rick's muttering was harsher tonight, his movements quick and jagged, and Morty sensed it, the threads bending under strain, stretching too thin. He hesitated, unsure if speaking would ease or worsen it, but the silence felt dangerous too. Finally, in a soft voice, Morty said, "Need a hand?" Rick didn't look up. "No, Morty, I've got it." The sharpness in his tone cracked against Morty's chest, but instead of retreating, he stayed. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air between them, as though the thread tethering them was demanding attention. Morty didn't argue, didn't push further, but he shifted closer, quietly picking up a tool Rick had dropped. He placed it back on the bench without a word. For a moment, Rick froze, his hand pausing mid-movement, and though he didn't thank Morty, the muttering softened, his breathing slowing almost imperceptibly. The hum steadied, not fading, but settling into something patient. Morty realized then that it wasn't about controlling the threads, it was about staying present enough not to let them snap. Sometimes words weren't needed. Sometimes simply not stepping away was enough. That night, Morty lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts circled endlessly, the day's moments layering over one another. The fight in the hallway, the girl's warning, Rick's sharpness softening by a thread's width. He could feel the web stretching outward, a network alive with both harmony and tension, and he understood more clearly than ever. The threads weren't a promise of safety. They were a responsibility, a reminder that every choice mattered, whether in stillness or in storm. As sleep crept toward him, the hum stayed close, low and steady, neither comforting nor threatening, simply present. It was a reminder he couldn't escape. The threads were always moving, whether he was ready to follow them or not. The night. After Morty felt the hum pressing against him, he woke before dawn, not because of a sound outside, but because of the echo of silence inside. It was heavy, almost expectant, as though the air itself was holding its breath. He sat up slowly, staring at the pale outline of his room, and realized he couldn't ignore it anymore. The threads weren't simply drifting through him, they were asking something of him. It wasn't about understanding them fully, not yet, but about deciding what kind of presence he would be within them. At school, the morning felt stretched thin, like paper ready to tear. The same two boys who had fought earlier now stood apart, their faces stiff, refusing even to glance at each other. Morty felt the hum like a throb in his ribs, sharper this time, and he wondered if silence could be just as destructive as conflict. He sat at his desk, restless, unable to focus on the teacher's words, until finally, during a break, he walked past them deliberately.
"Hey," he said softly, almost unsure. "You don't have to keep it like this." They looked at him with confusion, then annoyance, but the threads stirred in the quiet space between them, trembling faintly. Morty didn't push further.
He just left those words hanging, like a lantern in a dark room. Sometimes light didn't force its way in. It waited. That afternoon, he found the girl waiting by the fence again. Her expression was harder to read this time, though her eyes softened when they met his. "You tried?" she said quietly, though he hadn't told her anything. "The threads aren't about fixing everything. They're about giving space for something different to grow." Morty nodded, though he felt the weight of her words pressing deeper than before. It wasn't about victories. It was about presence, about nudging the web just enough to let it breathe. But when he returned home, the tension was louder. Rick's voice cut through the garage walls, sharp and bitter, his muttering more like growls. Morty lingered at the doorway, feeling the hum grow restless again. He could see Rick pacing, tossing tools aside, knocking over a half-finished gadget. The chaos in his movements matched the distortion in the threads, like a note struck off key, vibrating into every corner. Morty's first instinct was to leave, to give Rick his space, but the hum pulsed stronger, tugging at him. It felt like the web itself was trembling, warning him that absence could shatter something fragile. So Morty stepped inside, his voice quiet but steady. "Rick, it doesn't have to eat you up like this." Rick froze, his shoulders tightening, but he didn't turn. For a long moment there was only the sound of his uneven breathing. Finally, Rick muttered, "You don't know what you're talking about, Morty." His words were sharp, but Morty could feel the thread stretching, not snapping. He stayed, not arguing, not defending, just standing in the same space, holding the silence with him. Rick eventually dropped the tool from his hand, the clatter loud against the floor, and sat heavily in the chair. He didn't speak again, and Morty didn't either, but the hum steadied, as if recognizing that sometimes simply not walking away was the choice that mattered most. The web wasn't asking him to solve Rick's storms, it was asking him to share the weight of them, even when it was uncomfortable. That night, Morty lay awake longer than usual, his mind full of the boys' hardened silence at school, the girls' knowing gaze, and Rick's unspoken surrender to exhaustion. The threads connected all of it, weaving through kindness, conflict, and quiet endurance. Morty realized then that the test wasn't in moments of clarity. It was in the moments where every instinct told him to retreat. The hum was no longer just a strange echo. It was a guide, pulling him toward choices that weren't easy, but were necessary. Sleep came slowly, wrapping him not in rest, but in thought. The threads weren't just outside of him anymore. They were becoming a part of him, binding him to others in ways he could no longer ignore. The responsibility was deepening, and somewhere in that silent knowing, Morty understood. The threads would keep testing him again and again until he either broke beneath them or learned to carry them with grace. The morning after the silence, with Rick lingered heavier than the others, Morty woke with a sense that the threads were no longer just weaving around him, they were waiting for him. The hum was there before he even opened his eyes, soft yet insistent, as if reminding him that the choice he had made the night before was only the beginning. He moved through his routine slowly, each step marked by an unease that wasn't fear. Exactly, but anticipation, like the feeling before a storm you can't quite see. At school, the tension from the two boys had not faded. Their anger seemed quieter, but only because it had sunk deeper, colder. Morty passed them in the hallway again, and the hum sharpened, pulling at him more urgently this time. He thought of the girl's words, how presence alone sometimes mattered, but today he could feel something different. The silence wasn't holding anything together anymore. It was fraying. For the first time, Morty realized that the threads weren't asking him simply to witness. They were asking him to act. So when one of the boys muttered under his breath and the other's jaw tightened in response, Morty stepped between them. His voice trembled, but it didn't break. "Look, I know you're both angry, but whatever's eating at you, it doesn't have to keep burning like this." They stared at him, incredulous, their anger momentarily disarmed, not by his words but by the strangeness of his interruption. Morty didn't try to fix it, didn't push for them to forgive each other. He simply gave them something else to hold on to besides the fight. A moment of pause, the threads steadied faintly, though still fragile, and Morty knew it wasn't over. But at least for now, it wasn't unraveling. Later, sitting under the tree by the fence, the girl appeared again, as though she had been waiting. "You felt it, didn't you?" she asked softly. Morty nodded, his chest tight. "It wasn't enough to stand by this time," he admitted. Her smile was faint, almost sad. "That's how it begins. The threads don't demand perfection, only courage. And courage often feels heavier than you think you can carry. Her words stayed with him long after she slipped away, vanishing into the quiet edges of the schoolyard. Courage. Morty wasn't sure that was what he had felt. It had been more like desperation, the fear of watching something fall apart without trying. Yet the hum inside him had steadied afterward, and that steadiness was its own kind of answer. Back at home, the garage was quieter than the night before. Rick was bent over his work again, but this time his movements were slower, less chaotic, though the sharp edges of his muttering still cut the air. Morty stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure if he should disturb him, until the hum flickered again. Not sharp this time, but steady, like a heartbeat reminding him of the bond he couldn't ignore. He stepped inside and spoke gently. "I saw a fight at school today. I didn't fix it, but I stopped it from getting worse." Rick didn't look up, didn't respond immediately, but the clink of tools softened, his hands pausing for a fraction longer than usual. Morty continued, I think being there matters, even if I don't know how to make it better." For a moment, Rick's shoulders lifted as though he might answer, but then they slumped again. He muttered something too low for Morty to catch, but it wasn't sharp, not bitter, just tired. And that was enough. The threads between them quivered softly, not in strain this time, but in quiet recognition. That night, lying in bed, Morty felt the hum differently. It wasn't only inside him, it was around him, through him, like an invisible net tying him to every voice, every silence, every choice that had passed through the day. The fight, the girl's words, Rick's unspoken reply. They weren't separate moments. They were strands of the same fabric, tugging at him gently but firmly, showing him that he couldn't drift anymore. He closed his eyes, the weight of responsibility pressing against him, but instead of fear, there was a strange calm. Not peace exactly, but a sense of being in motion, part of something larger than himself. The hum was no longer a question, it was a call, and Morty knew he would have to answer it again sooner than he was ready. The next morning came with a grey sky, the kind that felt heavy even before the rain began. Morty woke to that hum again, low and steady, but this time it wasn't just in him. It was pressing outward, pulling at the edges of his awareness like a tide that refused to recede. He moved through his morning routine slower than usual, caught between the ordinary rhythm of brushing his teeth and tying his shoes, and the strange certainty that today would test him differently than before. At school, the boys from before kept their distance, their fight reduced to silence, but the threads between them still pulsed with bitterness. Morty felt it when he walked past, a dull vibration in his chest that reminded him not all wounds closed quickly. He wanted to intervene, to smooth the edges, but something stopped him. An intuition that his role wasn't to rush healing, but to hold space for it. Still, the weight of their silence stayed with him as he drifted through his classes, unable to shake the hum that whispered like a warning beneath every word. When lunch came, Morty sat alone under the tree. For once, the girl wasn't there. He felt the absence sharply, like a note missing in a song he had grown used to. The silence stretched, unsettling in its unfamiliarity. He wondered if she had left because she knew what was coming, because she understood that today wasn't about guidance, but about Morty standing on his own. That thought left his chest heavy but also certain. Whatever was waiting, it would not be eased by someone else's wisdom. The storm broke later in the day, rain falling in steady sheets against the windows. By the time Morty reached home, the world was drenched and blurred, the driveway slick with water. He entered the garage to find Rick again, but this time the tension was unmistakable. Rick was seated at his bench, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a flask. The hum inside Morty surged, louder than it had ever been, not a quiet tug, but a resounding call that left him breathless. Rick muttered without looking up, his words slurred but sharp. "It doesn't matter, Morty. None of it matters. You think threads or choices or kindness change anything? It's all noise in the void." The bitterness in his tone hit Morty harder than he expected, not because of the words themselves, but because he could feel the threads buckling, the connection between them straining as if it might snap completely. For a long moment, Morty stood frozen, the rain hammering against the roof, the hum pressing so forcefully in his chest that it felt
Almost painful.
He thought of all the times he had chosen silence before, of the small moments where presence had been enough. But this time he knew silence would break everything. The threads weren't asking him to stay, they were demanding he speak. So he stepped forward, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "You're wrong, Rick. Maybe it doesn't fix everything, maybe it doesn't change the whole universe. But it matters here, right now, to me, to you. If it didn't, I wouldn't feel it this much." Rick finally looked at him, his eyes bloodshot, his expression caught between disbelief and something softer that Morty couldn't quite name. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding, and Morty wondered if he had gone too far. But the hum steadied, holding him upright, reminding him that this was the moment he had been pulled toward since the beginning. Rick didn't respond right away. He just stared, and Morty realized that sometimes words didn't crack open walls. Immediately, they just left marks on the surface, waiting for time to do the rest. The hum softened in his chest, not fading but shifting, like an echo that had finally been acknowledged. That night, Morty lay in bed, listening to the rain outside. The weight of the day pressed against him, but it wasn't crushing. It was clarifying. He had spoken when silence wasn't enough. He had chosen to act, not perfectly, not with certainty, but with courage. And as his eyes drifted shut, he understood that the threads weren't only guiding him outward, they were shaping him inward, weaving him into someone he hadn't known he could become. The rain eased by morning, leaving the world damp and shining, as though the storm had rinsed everything clean. Morty woke with the hum softer now, less like a demand and more like a presence that settled into him, quiet but unshakable. He carried it with him as he moved through his day, the memory of his words to Rick still echoing in his chest. For once, he didn't feel like he had stumbled blindly into something. He felt as if he had chosen a step that truly belonged to him. At school, he noticed things he hadn't before. A girl sitting alone at lunch, her eyes lowered to her tray, the isolation around her thick and heavy. A teacher who snapped at a student for speaking out of turn, though Morty could see the weariness etched in her face, the kind that came from more than just one restless day. He felt the hum respond each time, faint ripples in his chest, reminding him that the threads weren't only tied to the dramatic moments, but also the quiet ones that most people overlooked. The two boys who had fought before crossed his path again. Their distance was still there, but the sharp edge of hostility had dulled. Morty realized that his small interruption, awkward and trembling though it had left some kind of mark. It wasn't resolution, but it had shifted something, even slightly. And that was enough for now. When the final bell rang, Morty lingered outside the building, the grey clouds parting overhead, to reveal patches of pale blue sky. The girl by the fence appeared once again, though her presence felt different now, less like a guide and more like a mirror. She watched him with her calm, steady eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "You're beginning to see it, aren't you? The web doesn't end where you thought it did." Morty nodded, unsure of how to put into words the way the hum seemed to stretch beyond him now, tugging at threads that wove through strangers, through fleeting glances, through moments that barely seemed to matter on the surface. He felt both awed and overwhelmed by it, as though he had stumbled into a map that revealed more roads than he could ever walk. That evening, when he came home, Rick was in the garage again. The silence between them was different this time, not brittle, but tentative, as if testing whether it could hold. Morty didn't mention the night before, and Rick didn't either, but the air carried something unspoken, a thread neither of them could deny any more. Morty sat on a stool nearby, pretending to busy himself with a box of scattered tools. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone carried the weight of what had already been said. And for once, Rick didn't push him away. That night, Morty walked into the backyard, the damp grass cool under his shoes. The sky was clearing now, stars blinking faintly into view. He stood there, breathing in the stillness, and felt the hum shift again. It wasn't confined to his chest anymore. It was in the air, in the quiet rustle of the leaves, in the faint glow of the stars themselves. He realized with startling clarity that the threads weren't bound by walls or people or even by what he understood. They stretched outward infinitely, a living web that tied everything together in ways beyond his comprehension. The thought should have frightened him, but instead it settled into him like a truth he had always known, just forgotten. He wasn't carrying the weight of the threads alone. He was a part of them, and they were a part of him. His choices mattered, yes, but so did everyone else's. He was not a savior, not a solitary bearer of responsibility. He was a single strand among countless others, and in that realization there was comfort. As Morty finally went to bed, he carried that calm with him. The hum was no longer a mystery pressing against him. It was a companion guiding him gently forward. And though he didn't know what waited beyond tomorrow, he knew that each step would build upon the last, weaving him deeper into the web that stretched beyond time itself. The calm Morty carried into the next morning clung to him like a second skin, but beneath it there was a quiet anticipation, as though the threads themselves were bracing for something. The world felt sharper in its details, the way sunlight scattered on the damp pavement, the murmur of conversations in the hallway, even the weight of silence in between. Every sound and movement seemed to hum with connection, subtle ripples that reminded him he wasn't separate from them anymore. At school, he noticed shifts so small that anyone else might have missed them. The girl who usually ate alone wasn't entirely alone this time. Another student had sat near her, not close enough to call it companionship, but close enough that the distance didn't feel so suffocating. Morty felt the hum stir faintly, like the acknowledgement of a choice being made outside his own. It reassured him that the web wasn't only his to carry, it was alive in everyone, quietly weaving its patterns, but the clarity also brought unease. Between classes, Morty found himself near the same two boys who had fought before. Though they no longer clashed openly, he saw the undercurrent of tension still simmering in their glances. The hum pressed against him, urging, reminding him that threads left untended could fray. For a moment he hesitated, caught between wanting to trust the web to balance itself and fearing that silence could let it unravel. Later, when he caught sight of Rick waiting by the car after school, Morty realized the hum wasn't just about strangers. It vibrated more urgently when it came to Rick. His grandfather leaned against the door with an expression that hovered between impatience and weariness. Normally, Morty would have shuffled quietly beside him, but today he held Rick's gaze a moment longer. Neither spoke, yet Morty felt a faint shift, as if some part of Rick was testing whether Morty's newfound steadiness was real or just another fleeting change. That evening, Morty sat in his room, turning the day over in his mind. The calm he had felt the night before wasn't gone, but it was different now, less like comfort and more like responsibility. The threads weren't only about noticing, they demanded something from him, choices that nudged others, even in ways they'd never see. He didn't know how much of that burden was his to claim and how much belonged to the web itself, but the question wouldn't leave him. When the house grew quiet, Morty slipped outside again. The air was cooler, carrying the scent of wet earth. Above him, the stars had gathered more thickly, their light sharper than the night before. He closed his eyes and let the hum spread through him, letting it guide his thoughts outward. That was when he felt it. Not just threads stretching infinitely, but threads tightening, converging somewhere close. The sensation sent a chill through him, not of fear exactly, but of inevitability. Something was drawing near, and then he wasn't alone. He opened his eyes and saw the girl by the fence once more, her figure clear in the dim light. She didn't step forward this time, didn't speak right away, only watched him as if weighing whether he was ready. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the faintest tremor, unlike the calm certainty she usually held. "You feel it too. The web isn't still, it's moving towards something. And when it arrives, the threads won't let either of us stand aside." Morty's breath caught, the calm in him flickering against a deeper current of unease. He wanted to ask what she meant, what was coming. But before he could, she turned and began to fade into the darkness, as though the night itself swallowed her form. The hum inside him surged in response, steady but urgent, reminding him that her words weren't just warning, they were part of what was already unfolding. He stood there long after she vanished, staring at the stars as though they might give him an answer. The calm had shifted again, layered now with the weight of knowing that the web was no longer just a presence to observe. It was a path pulling him forward, one step at a time, towards something he couldn't yet name, but could no longer avoid. The night lingered in Morty's thoughts long after he returned inside. Her words echoed in him, soft but relentless, weaving themselves into the hum until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The web isn't still, it's moving towards something. It wasn't a warning that could be pushed aside, it was a certainty as real as the pulse in his chest. Even when sleep came, it was shallow, threaded with faint images of stars bending together, lines of light converging into something he couldn't yet see. Morning arrived heavy. The air felt thick, as if the whole house was holding its breath. Morty moved through his routine automatically, but every sound, a door creaking, the faint buzz of the television, seemed stretched, sharper, as though time itself had slowed to let the threads settle into place. When he stepped outside, the sky was pale and cloudless, but instead of comfort, it gave him the impression of a stage waiting for its first move. At school, the hum pressed harder, pulling at him in moments too precise to ignore. He noticed the same two boys again. This time, neither glared nor spoke, but the tension between them had hardened into something quieter, heavier. Their silence wasn't peace, it was restraint, a fragile barrier that could snap with the smallest push. Morty felt the weight of it in his chest, the web almost vibrating, as though testing whether he'd intervene or let it unravel. For the first time, he wondered if every choice he made, or failed to make, was being gathered for the moment the girl had spoken of. Later in the day, during science class, the hum surged in an unexpected direction. Morty glanced sideways and caught sight of another student, someone who usually drifted at the edges of the room, suddenly leaning forward, scribbling notes with unusual intensity. It was a small thing, but Morty felt the thread connecting, them spark briefly like an unseen flame. The detail lodged in his mind, though he couldn't explain why. He sensed it mattered, even if the reason lay hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When the final bell rang, Rick was
there again.
This time, Morty felt a stronger pull from him, almost overwhelming compared to the subtle threads at school. Rick didn't say much as they drove home, only muttered about traffic and the irritation of wasted time, but Morty saw it differently. The way Rick's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, the way his eyes darted more often than usual toward the mirrors. There was something beneath his grandfather's calm exterior, a weight Rick didn't share out loud. The web thrummed in response, drawing Morty's attention again and again toward him, as though trying to show that whatever was converging, Rick wasn't separate from it. That evening, Morty couldn't stay still. The quiet of his room felt suffocating. So he wandered back outside, half expecting to find the girl waiting by the fence. She wasn't there. Instead, he felt the pull stretch outward, tugging him toward the far end of the street where shadows gathered beneath a row of trees. His steps slowed, cautious but deliberate, until the hum shifted sharply, as if the air itself leaned closer. From the corner of his vision, a flicker of movement caught his attention. He turned, but nothing was there, only branches swaying in the faint wind. Still, the sensation lingered, pressing against him more urgently now. He stood still, letting the silence deepen until the threads revealed themselves again. This time, he didn't just hear the hum, he felt it coil around him, layering the present moment with something older, heavier, as though time itself was folding inward. And then, faintly, he heard her voice. Not beside him, but carried through the web, echoing in the air like a memory set free. "It's beginning. You'll see the signs clearer now. Don't turn away, Morty. If you do, the threads won't forgive you." His heart pounded, but he didn't run. The words weren't threat. They were a truth he already knew. He stayed there, letting the night press against him until the feeling began to fade, leaving him standing alone under the dim light of the street. But the calm he had once clung to was gone now, replaced by something sharper, resolve, fragile but steady. By the time he returned home, he understood what the hum had been trying to show him. The convergence wasn't some distant event waiting.
On the horizon, it was already spilling into the present, shaping the choices he made, drawing people closer to one another in ways he couldn't yet see fully.
And somewhere within it all, Rick, the girl, the strangers at school, they were threads tied into the same design, leading toward a moment that would demand more from him than quiet observation. As Morty lay awake, staring at the faint glow under the ceiling, he realized the web wasn't asking him to wait anymore. It was asking him to step into it, to carry its weight forward. The next morning began with an unusual quiet. The kind that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, as though the house itself was bracing for something unseen. Morty moved carefully. Every sound he made running water, footsteps on the floorboards, seeming too loud, almost intrusive, against the stillness. He thought of the girl's voice echoing in his mind the night before. It's beginning. The words hadn't left him, clinging now with sharper edges as the day unfolded. At school, the change was immediate. The hallways buzzed louder than usual, conversations overlapping with restless energy that had no clear source. Morty noticed details others ignored, the flicker of a light overhead, stuttering in rhythm with the hum, the way a group of students shifted as though pushed by an unseen hand, their movements aligning without effort. The threads were no longer faint or scattered. They pulsed with clarity, pulling him closer to something inevitable. In class, the tension that had once been subtle grew more insistent. The two boys he had watched before were no longer silent. Words flared between them, sharp and quick, like sparks striking dry ground. Morty felt his chest tighten as the hum surged, the web vibrating in a way that left no doubt. This was one of the signs. Yet he didn't move at first, only watched, caught between fear and the strange knowledge that his choice in this moment mattered. When one boy finally slammed his hand against the desk, rattling the room into silence, Morty felt it. The threads around him constricted, waiting for him to act. Before he could, the teacher intervened, breaking the moment with practiced calm. But the weight didn't lift. Morty knew the web wasn't finished, it had only shifted, waiting for the next turn. He scribbled meaningless notes, unable to focus, the hum pressing like static against his skull. Later, as the final bell rang, Rick was waiting. He leaned against the car with a look that was harder than usual, his eyes scanning the street before settling on Morty. "You're walking different," Rick muttered once Morty slid into the seat. "Like you figured out something you weren't supposed to." Morty froze, unsure how much Rick could sense, but the words struck deep. He wanted to ask what Rick meant, if he felt it too, the pull, the tension, the threads weaving tighter. But Rick said nothing more, starting the engine with a sharp turn of the key. The drive home was filled with silence, yet Morty felt more spoken to in that silence than he had in days. That night, the web gave no rest. Morty lay in bed, the hum louder than ever, drawing him toward the window. The sky was unusually clear, stars spread across the darkness like shards of glass, each one brighter than the last. He watched them until his breath caught. The stars weren't just shining, they were shifting, faint but certain, moving as though pulled toward a single point. His chest tightened. The convergence was no longer a distant idea. It was visible, written across the night itself. Morty pressed his palm against the glass, his body trembling with the certainty that this was what the girl had meant. Every thread, every choice, was leading here. And he couldn't deny it anymore. He wasn't just an observer. He was part of it. Then a sound broke the silence, a low creak, not from his room, but from somewhere deeper in the house. Morty froze, listening as it came again, heavier this time, deliberate. He turned slowly, the hum spiking in his ears as though the web itself was straining. The door to his room shuddered just slightly, as though something pressed against it from the other side. Morty's breath caught. The signs weren't only around him now. They were here, inside, spilling into the walls of his own home. The convergence had begun its first clear step, and he realized with a sharp clarity that the next move would no longer wait for him to choose. The door trembled again, its hinges groaning softly, as if the weight on the other side was both immense and hesitant. Morty's pulse quickened, But he didn't move, his body caught between the instinct to run and the strange certainty that he needed to stay. The hum of the web thickened around him, threads pulling tighter, almost visible in the edges of his
vision. They shimmered faintly, bending toward the door as though guiding him to it. He swallowed hard, pressing his palms into his blanket, grounding himself against the pull. Then the sound shifted. Not a knock, not a push, but a whisper.
Soft, almost human, muffled through the wood. Morty leaned forward, his breath shallow, straining to catch the words. They were broken, fragmented, but familiar in tone, like the girl from his dreams. Morty. It's closer now. Don't look away. His skin prickled, the weight of the words sinking into him as though they carried more than sound. Gathering his courage, he stood, feet touching the cold floor, and reached for the handle. His hand hovered there, trembling. He didn't know what waited, only that opening the door would change everything. But before he could decide, the house itself interrupted. A sudden bang from below, a door slamming, hurried footsteps broke the fragile moment. The whisper vanished, leaving only silence pressing against his ears. Rick's voice cut through the stillness. "Morty! Downstairs now!" It wasn't his usual tone, no grumble or sarcasm. It was sharp, urgent, carrying the edge of someone who had already seen too much. Morty's hand fell from the knob, heart still racing as he stumbled back. He didn't look again at the door. Whatever was there could wait. Or maybe it wouldn't. Either way, Rick's call left no space for hesitation. Descending the stairs, Morty noticed the lights flickering more violently than before, casting the walls in jerky shadows that seemed alive. Rick stood in the kitchen, staring out the window into the backyard. His face was lined with something heavier than curiosity, an unspoken recognition. Without looking at Morty, he muttered, "It's starting to bleed through." Morty wanted to ask what, but before the words formed, he saw it. Beyond the glass, the air shimmered, not like heat waves, not like mist, but like the threads themselves had spilled into reality. They stretched and wove across the yard, twisting in slow arcs, faintly glowing. The hum inside Morty's chest matched them perfectly, vibrating in rhythm, making his bones feel hollow and full, all at once. Rick finally turned, his eyes locking with Morty's. For a fleeting moment, there was no mask of detachment, no sardonic
armor. Only a flicker of something close to fear. "You've been feeling it, haven't you?" The pull. Morty nodded, barely trusting his voice. Rick sighed, running a hand over his face. "Then it's too late to pretend."
"You're in it, whether you like it or not." The words landed heavier than Morty expected. He had wanted acknowledgement, proof that what he felt was real, but now that it came, the weight pressed into his chest. Before he could respond, the threads outside shifted. They converged at a single point in the center of the yard, glowing brighter until the darkness bent around them. And from that convergence, a shape began to emerge. It wasn't fully formed, more silhouette than substance, but Morty could see the outline of limbs, a figure rising from the weave itself. The whisper he had heard upstairs echoed again. Not through the door this time, but through the night air. "Morty, don't turn away." The voice carried both warning and comfort, leaving Morty frozen at the window, unable to breathe. Rick's hand clamped onto his shoulder, grounding him, though his own voice shook slightly. "Whatever happens, don't touch it. Not yet." The figure outside shifted, tilting its head as though aware of their gaze. Its outline pulsed brighter, threads snapping and reweaving with each movement. The air vibrated with a low hum that rattled the glass, pressing into their bones. Morty
couldn't move.
He felt both seen and summoned, as though every step of his life had been pulling him to this exact moment. His heart pounded, his breath shallow, but he didn't look away. He couldn't. The convergence had taken shape, and for the first time it wasn't distant, wasn't theoretical. It was standing in his backyard, waiting. The figure outside held its place in the yard, woven from threads of light and shadow, flickering as though it was both there and not. Morty felt rooted to the floor, unable to turn away, the hum rising in his chest until it threatened to spill out of him. Rick's grip on his shoulder tightened, but it wasn't steady. It trembled faintly, betraying the truth Rick rarely admitted. He didn't fully understand this either, or if he did, it unsettled him in ways Morty had never seen before. The air pressed heavier against the windows, as though the night itself leaned closer. The figure shifted, raising its head, and Morty swore it was looking straight at him. No eyes, no face, yet he felt the weight of its gaze, quiet and insistent. His breathing stuttered. It wasn't a creature in the normal sense. It was a message, a pattern given shape, a piece of the web standing on its own. Rick muttered under his breath, words Morty couldn't fully catch. Calculations, half-thought theories, warnings meant more for himself than anyone else. Then louder, sharp, "Morty, listen to me, whatever." You think it's saying, "Don't answer," not out loud. But the moment Rick said it, Morty felt the threads coil tighter inside him, the voice from before, whispering again, "Morty, don't turn away. You're almost ready." The pull was unbearable. He wanted to step outside, to feel the air between the threads, to know why they had chosen him. But Rick's hand held him fast, and something about the urgency in Rick's eyes stopped him from moving. Still, the figure took a step closer, its form unraveling and reweaving as it walked, leaving faint strands drifting like cobwebs across the grass. The lights inside the house flickered wildly, every bulb straining against the hum, and for a moment the walls themselves seemed thinner. Shadows stretched long and unnatural, bending toward the same point as the figure. Morty's chest ached, each heartbeat sinking closer to the vibration outside. He felt like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Rick pulled him back from the window, forcing him toward the stairs. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice hard but low, as though even speaking too loudly might draw the figure in. "It's not just watching, it's trying to anchor." Morty stumbled but followed, though his eyes kept drifting back to the glow outside. The figure had paused at the edge of the house, waiting, almost patient, like it knew Morty would return to it no matter what Rick tried. In the basement, Rick flicked on a panel Morty had never noticed before, concealed behind shelves of clutter. Lights blinked awake, revealing rows of strange devices humming faintly. "You're not ready to touch that thing," Rick muttered, pulling levers and typing rapidly on a terminal. "If it binds to you now, it's over. You'll lose yourself before you even understand what you're part of." Morty's hands shook. "But it's talking to me. It knows me." His voice cracked, caught between awe and terror. Rick slammed a fist against the console. "That's the point. It knows too much. You can't trust it." He looked at Morty, his eyes suddenly sharp and bare. "You're the one it wants. That's why I've been keeping you close. But wanting you doesn't mean it'll spare you." The words hung in the air, heavier than the hum itself. Morty's throat tightened, but before he could respond, the basement lights dimmed. A low vibration spread through the walls, deeper and slower than before. The figure outside had grown, brighter, its threads reaching farther, creeping through the cracks of the house. They curled like tendrils along the walls, faint but undeniable. Morty's chest burned. He felt both fear and longing tangled together, the whisper pressing closer in his mind. Almost ready, almost here. Rick worked frantically at the controls, pulling wires, rerouting power, trying to slow the spread. But Morty knew whatever was happening wasn't something Rick could stop with machines. The web had chosen its path, and he was at the center. The basement shook lightly, dust drifting from the ceiling. Morty's heart hammered, and for a moment he thought he heard not just one whisper, but many layered voices rising and falling like a lullaby. They spoke not in words, but in feeling, and the feeling was clear. Step forward, and Morty realized with startling clarity that sooner or later he would. Morty's breath came shallow and uneven as the walls of the basement groaned.
Under the weight of something unseen.
The figure outside had not moved closer, yet its presence filled every corner, every flicker of shadow, every vibration under the floor. Rick's fingers flew over the console, his muttering sharp and clipped, but even Morty could hear the strain beneath it. Machines whirred, screens flashed red, and alarms gave soft warning tones that meant little compared to the living hum crawling into Morty's bones. He pressed his hands against his ears, but the whisper threaded through regardless.
Calm and steady.
Step forward, Morty. The net is open, you're already within it. His chest ached as though the words had weight, pulling him toward the stairs. He wanted to resist, wanted to trust Rick's urgency, but part of him was beginning to understand. Something Rick refused to admit. The figure wasn't forcing its way inside. It was waiting for Morty to invite it. Rick slammed a lever down and sparks burst from the wall. The machines dimmed, leaving the room bathed in low, pulsing light. He spun toward Morty, eyes wild. It's testing the house, looking for weak
spots. If you give it a way in, it won't just stop with you, it'll consume everything around you. Do you understand? That thing isn't a guest, it's a floodgate. Morty swallowed, trembling, his voice barely above a whisper. But it doesn't feel angry. It feels like it knows me, like it's waiting for me. Rick's jaw clenched, his expression caught between frustration and fear. That's how it works. It doesn't come with teeth and claws, it comes with trust.
That's why you're dangerous to it, and why it's dangerous to you. He grabbed Morty's shoulders, shaking him just enough to cut through the haze. You have to fight it, Morty. Not everything that calls your name deserves an answer. The basement lights flickered again, then went dark altogether. For a heartbeat there was silence, thick and absolute, and then the hum surged louder, filling the void with an almost physical pressure. The house trembled softly, and Morty knew, without seeing, that the threads had finally slipped inside. He could feel them brushing the edges of the room, faint and delicate, like strands of silk moving through air. Morty's knees buckled, and he gripped the side of the console. The voices layered again, countless whispers overlapping, and in the blur, he thought he could make out words forming from the collective murmur. Don't be afraid, you're already part of us. One step and you'll see clearly. He looked at Rick, desperate. But Rick's face was lit only by the glow of a single emergency screen. For once, the scientist didn't have immediate instructions, no quick fix to slam into place. Instead, he met Morty's eyes with something softer, a rare flicker of vulnerability. You don't have to answer them, Morty. You still have a choice. The room vibrated harder, dust trickling from above. Morty could feel the threads circling, curling like invisible hands reaching toward him. His breath hitched as one brushed across his arm, not painful, but electric, as though a secret had been planted in his skin. He gasped, pulling away, but the hum within him grew stronger in response. The lines between outside and inside blurred. He could no longer tell if the sound was in the room or inside his chest. The urge to step forward clawed at him, stronger than ever. His mind flashed with images, fractured, luminous, fleeting. Endless webs stretching across skies he didn't recognize, countless figures made of the same shimmering thread, and at the center a vast structure pulsing like a heart. The vision faded quickly, but the sense lingered. The figure wasn't alone, and neither would he be if he answered. Rick's hand caught his wrist, grounding him. "Morty," he said, firm but not unkind, "look at me. If you walk into that, you're not coming back the same. Maybe not at all. Whatever you think you're missing, whatever they're offering, it's not worth losing yourself." Morty's lips trembled. He wanted to believe him. He wanted to stay rooted. But the hum swelled again, rising in unison with his heartbeat, and the whisper inside grew impossibly clear. "Sooner or later, you'll come. Why wait any longer?" And though Rick held him, though the machine sputtered in resistance, Morty knew deep down that the choice was closing in.
Not whether he would answer, but when. Morty's hand trembled in Rick's grip, the tension between them as fragile as glass about to shatter. The figure outside no longer felt separate. Its hum pulsed in Morty's veins as though it had already
claimed space within him. Each whisper curled around his thoughts like smoke, seeping into every hesitation. Rick's hold was firm, but Morty could feel his resolve slipping. The more Rick pressed, the more the threads pressed back, coaxing, soothing, luring him away from resistance. The basement shook again, faint but insistent, as if the house itself was caught between two forces. Machines sputtered and sparked, their lights fading into erratic pulses. Rick cursed under his breath, darting to stabilize the failing systems, but the emergency glow was quickly swallowed by shadows that moved unnaturally slow, almost liquid. Morty blinked hard, realizing they weren't shadows at all. They were threads, thin and translucent, stretching along the walls and floor like veins.
They had seeped inside completely. "Rick," Morty whispered, voice breaking. "It's already here." Rick spun around, eyes wide, confirming what he had dreaded. "No, no, no, that's not here, Morty. It's inside you. That's how it spreads. That's why you can't give it even one more thought." He lunged toward a control panel and yanked a heavy lever.
The entire basement roared as barriers flared, a dome of flickering energy rippling through the room. The threads recoiled, shriveling back with a hiss like steam retreating from flame, but Morty staggered, clutching his chest. The hum inside didn't weaken. It grew sharper, almost pained, as if the barrier had cut him too. He gasped, his knees buckling, and Rick caught him before he hit the floor. Morty's eyes glowed faintly, not with any light of their own, but with a reflection of something beyond the basement, as though the webs themselves had etched patterns onto his pupils. "They don't want the house," Morty said, his voice trembling, half his own and half borrowed. "They don't even want this world. They just want me." Rick froze, the words hitting him harder than any explosion. He stared at Morty like he was trying to see the boy through the shimmer that was taking hold. "That's not you talking, Morty. That's them. And if you let them keep speaking through you, you're done." The hum spiked, and Morty convulsed, gripping Rick's arm with unnatural strength. His mouth opened, and the whisper poured out, layered with countless voices speaking in eerie unison. "We are not your enemy." We are your reflection. Step forward, and you will see the design. You will no longer be small. You will no longer be alone. Rick gritted his teeth, pulling Morty close, forcing his forehead against his. Listen to me, Morty. You are not a reflection. You are my grandson. You're not some pawn for a cosmic web to string up. You're you, and I'm not losing you to something that thinks it can rewrite who you are. Morty's chest heaved as he fought the pull, his mind caught between the comfort of the threads and the desperate edge in Rick's voice. The visions returned, skies stitched with luminous lines, beings woven entirely of thread, all calling his name. But behind them, faint and stubborn, came flashes of his own life, his mom's worried face, Summer's sarcastic laugh, even Jerry's bumbling attempts at fatherhood. And above them all, Rick, reckless, broken, flawed, but real. The hum faltered for the first time, wavering like static, struggling to hold a signal. Morty gasped, his grip loosening, but just as quickly the figure outside pressed harder, threads surging through the walls, crackling against the barrier. The basement shuddered violently, dust raining from the ceiling. The web's whisper turned urgent. The choice is already made, Morty. You've felt it. Come now or be torn apart by what resists you. Morty cried out, collapsing to his knees. Rick fell with him, wrapping both arms around him as though he could shield him from something that wasn't physical. Fight it, Morty. You're stronger than you think. Don't let it decide for you. You're the one who chooses. For a heartbeat, Morty's body was still, his eyes locked in the shimmer of the unseen threads. Then a tear slipped down his cheek, cutting through the glow. His voice was quiet, but steady. I don't want
them. I want me.
The barrier roared brighter as though responding to his words, pushing the threads back harder, burning them into retreat. The figure outside flickered, its shape unraveling, stretching into the dark until it became indistinguishable from the
night. The hum shrank, twisting into a final murmur before vanishing altogether. Silence fell, heavy, complete, suffocating. Morty collapsed into Rick's arms, drained but still breathing.
The shimmer faded from his eyes, leaving only exhaustion. Rick held him tight, his jaw trembling, though he masked it with a muttered curse. You stupid, stubborn kid, you almost let them take you. Morty managed a weak smile, his voice breaking. Almost. Rick exhaled shakily, relief mixing with unease. He glanced at the flickering machines, at the scorched barrier walls, and at the faint cracks in the ceiling. It wasn't over. The figure hadn't been destroyed. It had only been pushed back. And deep down, Rick knew this was just the beginning of something much larger. Rick didn't move right away. His arms stayed locked around Morty, as though the boy might dissolve if he let go. The silence that settled in the basement was deceptive. It wasn't peace, not really. It was the kind of stillness that follows a storm, fragile and waiting for the next break. The hum was gone, yes, but Rick's gut twisted with the certainty that the threads hadn't vanished. They had simply retreated, circling, watching, waiting for their next chance. Morty's breathing was shallow but steady. His head rested against Rick's chest, too weak to lift, his skin pale and clammy. Rick could feel the faint tremor running through him, like his body was still caught between two pulses, one his own, the other lingering from what had tried to claim him. He cursed under his breath, scanning the machines around them. The barrier. Dome sputtered, its glow shrinking, the systems struggling to hold. Sparks crackled across the panels, the circuitry already burned out from overload. They were safe for now, but barely. With a grunt, Rick adjusted his grip and pulled Morty to his feet. The boy wobbled, but managed to stand, leaning heavily against him. "Come on, Morty," Rick muttered, his voice rough. "We're not staying down here. If the house collapses because of all this, I'm not going to be explaining to your mum why I let her kid get buried in the basement." Morty gave a faint, weary laugh, though it quickly dissolved into a cough. His throat felt raw, every word and all effort. "Rick, what was that thing? Why did it want me?" Rick didn't answer right away. His mind was racing too fast for words. He thought of the shimmering figure, of the threads that moved like veins through reality, of the voice that had spoken through Morty with promises far too targeted to be coincidence. They hadn't been after anyone else, not the house, not the machines, just Morty. That detail lodged itself deep in Rick's thoughts, heavier than any equation he'd ever solved. They made their way up the basement stairs, each step groaning under their weight. The house above was dim, the flicker of power from the basement failing to reach the upper rooms. The quiet here felt different, cleaner, almost eerily normal compared to what they'd just left behind. Morty collapsed onto the couch the moment they reached the living room, his body folding in on itself with exhaustion. Rick remained standing, pacing the room, running a hand through his hair. Morty's eyes followed him, half-lidded but searching.
"You're not saying anything. That's worse than when you're yelling. What aren't you telling me?" Rick stopped, his back turned. He stared at the shadow, stretching across the wall, long and distorted. "I'm telling you everything."
"I know, Morty, which is not enough. That thing isn't new. I've seen patterns like it before, out there in the void. But they were never this focused, never this personal." Morty swallowed hard. His chest ached with each breath, but the question forced its way out. "So why me?" Rick finally turned, his eyes sharp but heavy with something he rarely showed.
"Worry." He crouched in front of Morty, gripping his shoulder. "Because you looked at it. You didn't just glance, you let it in. And once something like that gets a glimpse of who you are, it doesn't let go. It's not about strength or weakness, Morty. It's about connection."
For some reason, that thing thinks you're the thread it needs. The words landed like a stone in Morty's stomach. He wanted to deny it, to tell Rick he hadn't let anything in, but the memory of the voices echoing through his own mouth silenced him. He had felt it. He had heard the promises, and part of him had almost believed them. That truth weighed heavier than any explanation Rick could give. The air in the room shifted then, subtle but unmistakable.
A chill crawled along Morty's skin, raising goosebumps. Rick felt it too. His head snapped toward the window. Outside, the street was still, but the faint outline of a shimmer passed across the glass, like light bending where it shouldn't.
Morty's heart lurched. "It's still here!" Rick's jaw clenched. "I told you they don't quit. They don't stop until they've either claimed what they want or been destroyed completely. And judging by how they retreated, I'd say we pissed them off." Morty's stomach twisted. He wanted to curl up, to shut it all out, but Rick's grip on his shoulder tightened, grounding him. "Listen to me, Morty. This isn't over." "What
happened down there? That was round one. If you let them in again, even for a second, they'll take more than your voice. They'll take you." Morty nodded weakly, his fear palpable, but tempered by Rick's certainty. Yet deep inside, he felt
a truth Rick hadn't said aloud. The threads weren't just chasing him. They were tied to him now.
No barrier, no basement, no machine could cut that bond clean. As the shimmer outside faded, the living room seemed to settle, but the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was a countdown, ticking toward the next strike. Morty closed his eyes.
The weight of exhaustion pulling him down, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. The whispers had gone quiet, but they hadn't left. They lingered, faint as breath against glass, waiting for the moment his guard slipped. Rick poured himself a drink with shaking hands he tried to disguise as steady. He glanced back at Morty, slumped on the couch, and muttered under his breath, "You're not theirs, Morty. You're mine, and I'll burn down every thread in this multiverse before I let them take you." But even as he said it, his eyes flicked to the window, to the faintest ripple in the night. He knew the truth. Fire alone wouldn't be enough. The night stretched on, every hour dragging beneath the weight of silence that refused to settle into comfort. Morty dozed on the couch, his sleep shallow and restless, his fingers twitching as if the threads still tugged at him even in dreams. Rick sat across the room, slouched in a chair with a bottle in hand, his gaze fixed on the dim glow of the streetlights leaking through the curtains. He hadn't touched his tools, hadn't scribbled formulas on the walls like usual. For once, the science could wait. He knew brute logic wouldn't untangle this, not yet. Around 3 in the morning, Morty stirred, his eyes snapping open with a sharp inhale. He sat up abruptly, blinking, searching the room as if expecting something. To be standing there. Rick didn't move, didn't speak, but he watched closely. Morty's breathing slowed after a few moments, though his hands were still shaking. "I saw it again," he whispered finally, his voice hoarse. Not like before. It wasn't inside me, just standing there, at the edge of the street, watching." Rick exhaled through his nose, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "That's not a dream, Morty. That's bleed-through. Means whatever this thing is, it's pressing harder now, trying to see how close it can get without being burned." Morty hugged himself, his body folding inward. "Why won't it stop?" Rick's jaw tightened. "Because it thinks you're a key. Something about you lets it slip into this dimension when it shouldn't. And keys don't get left alone, they get used. Or they get destroyed." The words hung heavy in the air, darker than Morty wanted to hear. He looked at Rick, searching, his face for reassurance, but found only raw truth etched there. Still, that honesty kept him grounded. Rick wasn't going to lie to soften the blow. That, in its own way, was comforting. The hours crept until morning light broke through the curtains, painting the room in pale gold. For a moment, the world looked ordinary again. The hum was gone, the shimmer absent, only the mundane sounds of birds outside breaking the stillness. Morty let himself breathe deeper, almost believing the danger had retreated. He even managed a faint smile when Summer clattered down the stairs, groggy and oblivious to the horrors of the night. She muttered something about the Wi-Fi being down, grabbed a granola bar, and left without noticing Morty's hollow eyes or Rick's stiff posture. When the door closed behind her, Rick finally stood, stretching his stiff joints. "All right."
"Morty, we're not going to sit here and wait for it to make the next move. That's how people end up losing their whole damn world."
"We go first." Morty's brow furrowed, confusion tangled with fear. "Go where?" Rick glanced toward the basement door, his expression hardening. "To the source. Whatever's weaving those threads isn't doing it from across the street. It's somewhere deeper, closer to the fault lines in reality. And if we can get to it before it finishes tying you up in its little web, we might just cut it off for good." The weight of that plan pressed down on Morty, but he nodded anyway. Anything was better than waiting. He followed Rick into the basement once more, though the machines looked worse than before. Blackened panels, flickering lights, wires hanging like veins torn from a body. Rick rummaged through the wreckage, muttering curses until he pulled.
Free a device, half-built but sparking with faint energy. This, Rick said, holding it up, is a tether.
Think of it like bait on a hook. It'll draw the threads in, give them a nice shiny signal to chase. Once they bite, we follow the line back to wherever the hell they're nesting. Morty swallowed, staring at the unstable glow pulsing within the device. And what happens when we find it? Rick smirked grimly. Then we cut the damn thread. The plan was reckless, dangerous, maybe even impossible, but Morty saw something in Rick's eyes that steadied him. Not arrogance.
Not detachment, determination. This wasn't about science anymore. It was about family. Rick strapped the tether to his belt, tossed Morty a smaller device, an emergency pulse meant to break minor connections, and keyed the sequence to activate.
The basement lights dimmed as the tether whirred to life, a hum building in the air, sharper than before, pulling against the edges of reality. Morty felt the shift instantly, the world bending like fabric stretched too thin. His vision blurred, then snapped into clarity, and he saw them, faint outlines of threads shimmering all around, converging toward the device like moths to flame. The hum grew louder, a vibration that rattled his teeth. Morty clutched the pulse in his hand, his body tense as the outlines thickened, forming into something more defined. For the first time, he didn't just sense the threads, he saw the thing behind them, a shape vast and skeletal, weaving itself together out of light and shadow, reaching toward him with limbs that bent wrong, too many joints, too many eyes glowing with recognition. Rick barked an order. "Hold steady, Morty!" As the tether locked onto the figure, a sharp line of energy stretching between them. The basement shook, dust falling from the ceiling, as though the whole house groaned under the weight of what they had just dragged into contact. Morty's pulse raced, fear clawing at him, but he didn't look away, not this time. The entity leaned closer, its voice crawling through his head, low and layered, promising again, "With me, you are not bound. With me, you are infinite." Rick snarled, tightening the tether's grip. "Ignore it, Morty. It's nothing but noise, dressed up as truth. Stay with me, kid." And for the first time, Morty did. He met the entity's gaze, the threads around him quivering, and whispered back, not to it, but to himself, "I'm not yours." The words broke something. The entity recoiled, its form shuddering violently, but the tether held fast. The basement blazed with impossible light, the first step into whatever lay beyond the weave of reality. The light roared around them, not like fire, not like electricity, but like a living storm of color tearing at the edges of the world. Morty shielded his face with his arm, though the brightness didn't burn. It seeped through, pressing into his skin, his bones, his thoughts. The basement groaned as though the foundations were dissolving, each brick trembling with a low moan that rose and fell with the pull of the tether. Rick held his stance, the device bucking in his grip, his jaw set as he forced the connection. Tighter. Morty clutched the emergency pulse, his knuckles white, his eyes wide, as the skeletal form writhed on the tether's line. Then, without warning, the floor seemed to give way.
Not broken, not collapsed, just gone. The world beneath them peeled back like paper lifted from glue, revealing a depth Morty couldn't comprehend. Threads stretched endlessly downward, weaving into vast corridors of light that pulsed as if
breathing. He gasped, his body swaying dangerously toward the gap, but Rick yanked him by the collar, snarling, "Stay close! Once we're in, there's no anchor but me." They plunged. The fall wasn't falling exactly, it was more like being drawn forward, pulled by invisible currents that wrapped around them and dragged them deeper. Morty's stomach lurched, but his mind felt eerily calm, as though some part of him had always known this place was waiting. Shapes moved in the distance, vast and delicate, shifting through the woven corridors like guardians or echoes of the thing they had followed. Their movements left ripples behind, like silk dragging through water. When they landed, it wasn't with a crash, but a quiet settling, their feet finding purchase on something that wasn't ground, but felt solid enough. Morty blinked, his chest tight, his lungs working harder in air that shimmered with faint particles. Around them stretched an endless expanse of threads, some thick as trees, others so fine they vanished when he tried to follow them with his eyes. Each strand glowed faintly, humming in tones too low to be called sound, yet he felt them in his ribs. Rick steadied the tether at his side, scanning the infinite web with narrowed eyes. So this is it, the loom. His voice was quieter than usual, not out of fear, but out of awe, though he'd never admit it. Every damn thread you see, that's a connection. Lives, choices, timelines, all tied up in knots like some cosmic sewing project. Morty swallowed, the vastness dizzying. And that thing? It came from here? Rick gave a grim nod. Or it is this place. Doesn't matter. Point is, it thinks you belong to it. That you're some kind of loose thread it can wind back into its little pattern. He glanced at Morty, his expression fierce. But you're not. As if summoned, the figure emerged again, drifting through the web like a shadow taking form. Its body was threaded together from strands of light and darkness, shifting constantly as if it couldn't decide on one shape. Its many eyes fixed on Morty, glowing brighter when it spoke. You've crossed the veil. You've stepped willingly into what has always been yours. The words slid through Morty's mind, not crushing this time, but persuasive, almost gentle. He felt the pull again, not harsh, but soothing, like slipping into warm water. His heart ached with the temptation to surrender, to let it weave him in and ease the endless weight of choosing, deciding, stumbling through life. Here there was no confusion, no mistakes, only belonging. Rick saw the way Morty's gaze softened, the way his body leaned forward just slightly. He barked, sharp and cutting. "Don't listen! That's not comfort. It's a cage. It doesn't
Care about you, Morty. It cares about what you unlock." He tightened his grip on the tether, sparks spitting from the device. And we're not going to let it wind you up like some damn marionette." Morty flinched, torn between the calm of the voice and the urgency of Rick's words. The entity moved closer, and the threads around them vibrated in unison, a chorus of whispers rising as if the whole loom was alive and calling his name. Morty's pulse raced, his body trembling, as both forces clawed at him. Then he remembered. Faint, but sharp, the feeling of Rick's hand on his wrist back in the basement. The weight of it, grounding, real, not perfect, not gentle, but human. And for the first time, Morty realized that maybe the difference between this vast, gleaming infinity and the messy world he'd come from was exactly that. Imperfection, mistakes, moments that couldn't be rewoven. He steadied himself, clutching the pulse in his hand tighter, though he didn't activate it yet. His voice shook, but he spoke anyway, eyes locked on the entity. "I'm not yours. I never was." The loom shuddered violently, the threads around them quaking as though the rejection had sent a shock through its core. The entity recoiled slightly, its form flickering, and for the first time Morty thought he saw something close to surprise. Rick's face cracked into a fierce grin. "That's it, Morty," he said, his voice almost proud. "Now we've got its attention." The web tightened, threads curling inward like a trap.
and Morty knew this was only the beginning. But for the first time since the hum had begun, he felt something stronger than fear.